On July 15, 2017, in an act of reconciliation, the mayor of Halifax, Nova Scotia, agreed to cover the iconic statue of Edward Cornwallis for the duration of a public protest. Mi'kmaq grandmothers were there demanding that the statue be removed. Cornwallis was known as the Butcher of Scotland for his brutal repression of Scottish independence. As the first governor of Nova Scotia, he terrorized Mi'kmaq in his promotion of settler colonialism. However, covering him up didn't change anything. Continuing their pressure, Mi'kmaq grandmothers, with the support from an informed public, saw the complete removal of the statue for good on January 31st, 2018. Of course, Cornwallis's history remains, but there now is nothing left to celebrate. Statutes are one thing. Centuries of policy are another. Although Canadians are intelligent people, they're poorly informed about the place of Indigenous people in Confederation. Most Canadians have no understanding of the foundational laws that respected Indigenous sovereignty or the brutal repression that has denied them access to fundamental human rights. Most Canadians have no understanding of Indigenous laws and governance practiced by many Indigenous nations. Most Canadians don't know that Aboriginal people have been the highest per capita recruits in every military conflict in support of Canada, from the War of 1812 to Afghanistan. That they've agreed to treaties to share their land with immigrants. That they have provided labor for the early industries of the fur and pemmican trade, for transportation, agriculture, construction, and logging. Colonial governments, while pretending to be benefactors and protectors of Indigenous people, have initiated policies that undermine integration by promoting racism, intolerance, exclusion from social and political life, and reducing Aboriginal people's economic potential. Why did they do this? What else? To get Indigenous land, resources, and to take away sovereign rights. While early laws like the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara protected Indigenous sovereignty and land possession, powerful elites and the growing wealthy class of Canada undermined these laws with policies in support of the existing European class system, which had grown out of the foundation of the slave trade and feudalism. As capitalism emerged, so did the nation states. The old medieval institutions of the crown, church, education, military, and banking were maintained and gave license to capitalists to plunder the Indigenous people and environments that had yet to be touched by feudal hierarchies. The principal force of colonialism, and much cheaper than armies, were the poor, destitute, and oppressed wage workers who were clogging the ghettos of Europe. And still today, colonial governments and corporate investors are using the working class by pitting them against Indigenous peoples' efforts towards self-determination. Canada accomplished statehood in 1867 with the British North America Act, the BNA. Of the 22 hours dedicated to discussion of the Act in the British Parliament, about 20 hours were spent on questions regarding Crown Indigenous relations. However, any concerns did not initiate amendments, and the Act passed with a minimum roll call. Following the BNA discussion and vote, the parliamentary seats filled to capacity to debate a much more controversial bill concerning Parliament's right to require dog licensing. The British North America Act gave the federal government, in Section 9124, responsibility for, quote, Indians and lands reserved for Indians, unquote. And it gave to the provinces, both established and to be created, the rights over lands and resources. the Indian would fall between the cracks of federal and provincial government legislation, ensuring negligible recognition and dependency on bureaucratic structures for handouts. 9 years after the British North America Act, the Indian Act of 1876 was passed in the new Canadian Parliament. The Canadian Department of the Interior 1876 annual report summed up the Indian Act in this way, quote, "Our Indian legislation generally rests on the principle that the Aborigines are to be kept in a condition of tutelage and treated as wards or children of the state. The true interests of the Aborigines and of the state alike require that every effort should be made to aid the red man in lifting himself out of his condition of tutelage and dependence. And that is clearly our wisdom and our duty, through education and every other means, to prepare him for a higher civilization by encouraging him to assume the privileges and responsibilities of full citizenship." Unquote. After 1885, the Indian Act continued to tighten the chokehold with amendments. Along with these amendments were also the requirement for Indians to acquire a pass before leaving the reserve. This effectively cut many people off from relatives and employment. And of course, the forced apprehension of Indian children and their placement in residential schools. This denied parents the ability to bond with children and literally destroyed their children's cultural attachment and mental health. With the Indian Residential School Settlement Act, of the 78,750 living recipients of compensation who had attended residential schools, over 40,000 went on to make successful claims of sexual and physical abuse. That's over half. All of these abuses were taking place under the watchful eyes of the Parliament of Canada and upheld as legal. Challenging the Indian Act and its administration was criminalized. The principal architects of Canadian Indian policy were Sir John A. Macdonald, who held the honor of Prime Minister and Minister of Indian Affairs at the same time. Also was Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs between 1913 and 1932. Before his appointment as the Deputy Superintendent, Duncan Campbell Scott had held a number of positions starting off in the late 1800s in the Indian Department. What MacDonald had started, Scott built upon with the support and agreement of the Parliament of Canada. In a letter from Duncan Campbell Scott in 1918 to British Columbia's Indian Agent General Major D. Mackay, Scott wrote, "It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared toward a final solution of our Indian problem." It seems as though we've learned nothing from past failures except to offer platitudes to the victims of our national crimes. As an Aboriginal person, I've come to believe that resolving political conflict will never be in the interest of the wealthy and political elite. All we can ever expect from this relationship is the original policy of the Indian Act. As for ordinary Canadians who work hard to avoid falling into a similar poverty, in 1960 over 50% of Canadian labor was unionized. Today, that's been reduced to 15%. Workers have lost security in the same way that Aboriginal nations have lost land. Pitting Aboriginal people against settlers and settlers against Aboriginal people has ensured a perpetual conflict in which both parties must turn to the colonial government for protection. they're still being played off against each other today. Like the Statue of Cornwallis, Canadian colonialism needs more than a shroud of secrecy and deception. In order to free all Canadian people from the growing catastrophe, the colonial system itself must be challenged and then dismantled. The original jurisdiction of Indigenous nations must be restored, and a shared partnership needs to be reflected in a constitution based on civil Indigenous rights, workers' rights, and sound ecological property rights. Canadians no longer expect Aboriginal people to be the only people on the front line. Get educated, reclaim an ethical relationship with the land and your neighbors, and be willing to stand up against oppression until the job is done. It can be done when we work together against colonialism.
Once we cover this man, and we're going to bury him because he's being kept alive with hate, and that's not fair to his spirit, eh? No, we're going to send him. We're going to send him where the Creator wants him to go, but we're going to end his spirit here today. We're going to take him down with love. We're going to take him down with ceremony. We're going to take him down with prayer. We're going to do it with tobacco. We're going to do it with song. And this poor man, and everything, the hatred and the bitterness and the contempt and the violence that he represents will also be forgotten. And we're showing the world now who we are. We're the peacemakers. We showed them how to live in peace. We showed them the way. They couldn't figure it out on the other side, did they? They had everything. They had every resource in the world, and they couldn't figure it out. They came here, and we showed them how to live in peace. We showed them how to live in equality, in brotherhood, and in love. We have our elder here, Isabel Knockwood, who is a residential school survivor, and one of our elders. I'm going to hand it over, and I want to tell you guys, I love you all very much. I love you too. Thank you. I love you all. Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.